Hello, everyone. I'm Nakanishi, early Shunitsa Curator of Culture, Art, and Education here at Poland Japanese Garden. I'll be the MC for this virtual panel discussion today, yet again. I hope this program really finds you and all your loved ones very well and in high spirits, wherever you are joining us from today. Before I do the pre-opening rituals to set the tone for the program, I just want to thank our garden supporters all across the board for making the exhibition as well as this program possible. I know I've been saying this almost religiously, actually, over and over again, but I truly believe that we do these programs to serve all the like-minded people out there who love nature, culture, and just being in tune with things around us. So thank you so much for putting your faith in us by supporting our programs. Well, this time again, we are just going to wait for a few more minutes just to let everyone come in and settle in front of their PCs or iPads and just be ready to take it all in. I guess Kanako, who is our dedicated operator, wonderful operator of ours, actually. Maybe you can start rolling the slides. Brilliant. Slideshow. Great. Yeah. It's much better than just, for the audience, viewing experience rather than keep looking at myself. So last week, I took a little time to virtually walk you through a little bit of who we are as a garden organization, becoming much more than a garden after nearly 60 years of constant development, thanks to all, obviously, our supporters, counterparts, and of course, the vision of the board. I also talked about some of the main reasons why we are doing these virtual programs, as well as the content of the actual exhibition, Healing Nature, and what it is that we are trying to showcase and honor using the fine photographic works by Ansel Adams, Dorothy Lane, and of course, Toyo Miyatake. This is one of the pieces. Yeah, that's the view from the actual current exhibition. Well, you know, time really does fly indeed, and the exhibition is coming now to an end this Sunday, having received a truly overwhelming amount of response and feedback from the general visitors. And because we realized that many people were not even able to fly over to see the exhibition, see the garden in person, and I think that includes a number of you actually. So I just put together the other day a virtual exhibition tour with help from our partner in New York City, the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnerships. So I will make sure we will include the link to that footage in our follow-up email after the program, along with the recorded footage from the other sessions as well. With that, I'm just gonna start delving right into today's session. For those of you who just joined us, I'm Aki Nakanishi, Arlen Shunitsa Curator of Culture, Art, and Education. And again, it's a genuine privilege to be the MC for this virtual session today, inviting distinguished speakers with a deep connection to the overarching subject matter, that is Manzanar. Last week, you can show the photos of the speakers, Bonnie Clark, Kenneth Helpan, and of course our son Uchiyama. Professor Kenneth Helpan talked extensively last week and passionately about how people of all ethnicity resort to garden making and placemaking as a means of not only survival, but also spiritual repose and self-actualization, if you like. While Professor Bonnie Clark touched on how microscopic archaeological research in one former campsite can actually unearth the imprisoned community's resourcefulness, ingenuity, and cultural heritage that really speaks to what it is that makes us all human. And today, this is the last, third, and final part of the three-part panel discussion that is associated with the main art exhibition that focuses on Manzanar, which, as a reminder, was one of the 10 American concentration camps that incarcerated approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of whom were actually American citizens by birth. And today's session with a panel of experts takes us right to Manzanar in the Owens Valley of California, where that particular garden, I'm sure many of you do remember, that particular garden, yes, this one, the Merritt Park, and dozens more gardens were actually created in this internment camp at Manzanar. With the overarching theme of cultural landscape and cultural archaeology in mind, today's question continues to be, why do people create gardens even beyond simple subsistence and beautification? And this will be addressed from multiple different perspectives throughout today's session. And with that, I'd like to begin introducing today's panel members after a couple of very quick housekeeping notes. So bear with me for just 2 more minutes. One, this session will again be recorded for later sharing. And it's also a repetition, but there will be a Q&A session towards the end of the program. You are using the Q&A box down below at the bottom of your screen. You can post questions at any point, throughout the program, but we will only be paying attention to them towards the very end. And please do be concise and clarify which speaker the question is addressed to. Well, without further ado, let's invite the speakers now. He and his family's story certainly was one of the biggest impetus for us, Poland Japanese Garden, to initiate this exhibition project nearly 3 years ago, to really think about peace and why nature matters even more in peacemaking. Sometimes powerful stories, as you know, become even more powerful when told by those who live them vicariously. Mr. Pat Alvarado is now a volunteer member of the reconstruction and rehabilitation project for the very garden that was created by his relatives at Manzanar some 78 years ago. Pat, it's just so great to welcome you here virtually today. He is perhaps the most prolific authority on archaeological as well as anthropological examination of the Manzanar historic site, which is the focal point of this exhibition. As the cultural resource program manager and park archaeologist at Manzanar, he has spearheaded countless excavation and restoration projects over the past decades to carry the torch for not just Japanese Americans, but all Americans who seek a more just and equitable society grounded in social justice. Mr. Jeffrey Barton joins us from California today. Thank you so very much for joining us, Jeffrey.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Last but not least, I never get tired of introducing our friend and one of the most revered landscape architects that we regularly turn to. He's the author of this monumental book entitled Defying Gardens that we kept referring to last time around as well, which is the truly go-to book for anyone with an interest in gardens or public spaces. He's the Philip H. Knight Professor of Landscape Architecture at University of Oregon Emeritus. Can't believe I just managed to say that all, but Professor Kenneth Halpern. Ken, it's so nice to have you back here today. Representing Poland Japanese Garden is my colleague, friend, and sensei, Sada Uchiyama, our garden's chief curator. Sada Uchiyama will be moderating this third and final session on Manzanar as cultural landscape specialist. Sada, it's so reassuring to have you here as the moderator again today.
I will try.
The floor is yours, Sada.
Okay, so good afternoon. I think we got the snow kind of melting away today, so I'm really happy. And again, I'd like to first of all welcome Jeff and Pat, and welcome to the garden, and good to have you, Kenneth, again. And so we have last week we had a great discussion. This is more like 1,000 feet on the view of what garden means, and by way of examining those the gardens, Japanese garden in particular, created in such a sort of, in a way, out of context in the sort of war zone or some very difficult, sometimes life-threatening conditions. So after the discussion and reading the Kenneth book, Defiant Gardens, sort of Defiant, to me, with the words garden together, kind of has a little more humane sort of tone of the words. And also, we learned a lot from Professor Bonnie Clark about, sort of how much we soil contain the histories, and it's just so wonderful to learn how actually garden archaeology takes place and can find. So today is actually, we are down to a specific site, namely the Manzanar, our exhibition site. And we have Pat and Jeff, and Jeff in particular coming from the actual site, still continued excavation, I believe, and research. So to begin with discussion, first I'd like to introduce the actually short 3 minutes presentation. After the first, Kenneth have a sort of short presentation, basically give us a sort of overview of Manzanar and the life in the Manzanar. Then we have a very actually rare the film that Jeff will show us, and then go into the discussion. So with this, Ken, please, your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Wait. Yeah. Am I not mute? I'm okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. Thank you, both Aki and Sada. Okay. I think most people listening or watching now know the basic history. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which was primarily directed at the 120,000 Japanese Americans living largely on the West Coast and in southern Arizona. Given anywhere between 6 and 21 days to put their affairs in order, people were removed to undisclosed locations away from their homes and communities. This action was in gross violation of constitutional protection and civil liberties. And it wasn't until 1988 that there was a belated official apology from our government, along with a reparations payment. The Federal War Relocation Authority, the WRA, moved people first to assembly centers, and some of these are on this map, where the camps were established, and then while the camps were being established. There were 10 camps, but our focus today is on one, Manzanar. Like all the camps, it was intentionally located in a remote area far from a population center. Manzanar was established in the sparsely populated Owens Valley of California in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Our focus today is on how individuals transformed the camp and under the most difficult of circumstances created a community with what I think are great American gardens. As places built with great rapidity, they also fall into the American Western tradition of instant communities. Eventually, Manzanar and all of these camps would also become ghost towns, not of vacant buildings, but of the presence of people who were forced to live there. Ultimately, Manzanar would house about 11,000 people, and it would be the biggest city between Reno and Las Vegas. The plan was simple. It was laid out in a military model at first glance that looked like an army camp, but with fences and guard towers revealed that it was a prison camp. Guard towers were set along the fence perimeter, and inside the camp, the basic layout was a grid, mostly unpaved roads, dividing the camp into blocks of wooden barracks separated by fire breaks, the little rectangles on the map of the barracks. Each block had 10 to 14 barracks with a mess hall, laundry, storage facilities, latrines, and recreation hall. The barracks were 20 by 100 or 120 feet. Each housed 4 families with 4 to 6 persons each. The residents immediately went to work to transform this inhospitable environment into a livable environment. Those sent to Manzanar were from Southern California. And before the war, the Japanese American community were the primary owners and workers in the landscape maintenance, nursery, and garden occupations. And they brought those skills and knowledge to the camp. Nearly 60% of Manzanar's internees had been farmers or gardeners before the war. The internees were given an empty frame that then they modified. This was encouraged and even facilitated by the camp authorities. But it was the residents' initiative and labor that transformed the camp. Working within the rigid framework of the plan they created by the WRA, they created complete open space systems. They created community parks, gardens for families at the entries to barracks, recreational spaces of fields and courts, community parks and gardens at mess halls in fire breaks. The internees essentially created their own town. The government wanted the camps to be self-sufficient. There were large communal victory gardens and agricultural gardens of orchards and fields. By 1943, Manzanar's farms produced over 42,000 pounds of produce. Internees constructed a reservoir and a canal to feed irrigation water to the camp, gathering the snow melt from the Sierra. Our focus today is on the gardens. Garden making, of course, is out in the open and was a sure sign of the internees exerting control over their situation. In fact, the gardens became one of the symbols and signatures of the camps themselves and were pointed to with pride by both the internees and the government authorities. In our last meeting, I spoke about the meaning of these gardens as symbols of hope, places of work, sites of resistance to camp authorities, as well as a way to maintain cultural identity and to create a home in an alien environment for people who've just been dispossessed. Beginning in 1993, though, the National Park Service began an exhaustive archaeological and cultural landscape survey of Manzanar. A leader of this endeavor is Jeff Burton, who you'll hear from soon, who's a partner on this panel, and many of the images you'll see of his excavations are in this show. A visitor to Manzanar before that work began would not have been aware that it was just below the surface. There were marks of habitation everywhere, but the desert had reclaimed much of the land. While all of Manzanar's buildings were removed and repurposed after the war, only the auditorium building remains, and that one is now the Park Visitor Center. However, remnants of the gardens were found throughout the camp. And largely through the assertive actions of camp veterans and the Japanese American community, Manzanar was designated a National Historic Site in 1992. The first garden created was the Katsuki Garden on Block 24, created within the first month of internment. It included a small pond made of granite from the Sierras, some miniature bridges, and trees, Joshua trees from Death Valley. Each garden had a distinct function. Entry gardens were part of the Japanese tradition of dooryard gardens, displaying the craft and skill of the resident and embellishing both the barracks and community spaces. These gardens displayed a great variety using gathered cacti and rocks, transplanted plants, and plants propagated in the camp nursery. Water features were especially welcome in this arid landscape. Stones were fundamental to the structural element and symbolic element of Japanese gardens, and that raw material was in abundance at Manzanar. Found stones became the raw materials for compositions of complex structure and symbolic meaning. Plants were scarce. However, Manzanar is Spanish for an apple orchard, and on the site were the remnants of a farming community that had been abandoned in the 1930s. And internees nurtured and incorporated long neglected apple and pear trees into their open spaces. What was discovered during the park survey was that there were gardens everywhere, and you're looking at part of that excavation. In recent years, there's been a concerted effort to first discover, then literally unearth and document the gardens, and then to restore some of them. And you can see here a beginning of the care of that archaeological investigation. Here at Block 15, and in the kind of mid-stage, as the garden is being slowly revealed. Or here in the restoration of the administration garden, essentially a before, during, and after images. The mess halls, though, became the location for Manzanar's most elaborate gardens. As people waited daily for their communally served meals at the mess hall, they'd witness the elaborate displays of great artistry and effort. Each garden was unique, but gardens outside these halls and the camp hospital shared common features. There was a rectangular perimeter of small stones framing a watercourse and a shaped pond at the center. Ponds were made more enticing with small islands, bridges, waterfalls, cascades, or fountains. There was a standard location in the blocks. Most of these gardens were similar size with a north-south irrigation, but they were also privy to the symbolic language derived from Japanese garden tradition. This is the block 33 Arai garden. You see it here, both with and without water. Here's block 9, an aerial view over midway in its restoration. And that garden after it was excavated and restored, and you dramatically see the Sierra Nevada martins defined it. One example of a splendid garden was at block 12, where there's a 50-foot long water garden that incorporated a roughly hourglass-shaped pond. There was a small island dividing the stream into 2 channels with a cascade on either side. The garden now again, midway in its being unearthed from the ground and then gradually restored. Here, the scale drawing showed in the excavation, and you more carefully can examine some of that in the survey, and then the magnificent restoration of that done by volunteers, such as Pat, you'll hear from later. The garden at Block 22, Mess Hall, took on an almost legendary status, as have the individuals in the creation. Hawaii-born Harry Ueno managed a fruit stand in LA before the war. Akira Nishi, along with his brother Koichiro, owned a San Fernando Valley nursery that specialized in roses. They decided to build a pond at their mess hall so people could enjoy it while they were waiting. The plan included the plan called for 24 bags of cement to line the bottom of the pond, but camp policy restricted them to only 3 sacks at a time. Very cleverly, they managed to get the necessary sacks to create the pond, but internees jokingly then referred to this pond as the 3-sack pond. Block 34 that you see here was a hill and pond style garden in 3 levels with a rise of stones and water source, again leading to a water source flowing to a lower pool. All of these gardens had partake of a deep symbolism rooting in Taoist and Buddhist belief. For example, the hill and stones represent Mount Shumyasen in Buddhism, said to be the highest mountain and sacred mountain at the center of the universe. The steepness and the jaggedness of the rocks combine 3 forces, often represented in garden compositions, with elements that represent the horizontal, earth, the diagonal, humanity, and the vertical, symbolic of heaven. At another level, the Block 34 garden is also a miniaturized landscape of a transition from mountains to stream, river, valley, and finally plain. As in all gardens at Manzanar, this transition is visible by lifting one's eyes to the mountains of the Sierra on the western horizon. Japanese gardens use the idea of shake, or borrowed scenery, and many of Manzanar's gardens capitalize on distant views and even draw the eye towards specific peaks or ranges. And one more of these restorations, Block 9, you see here both before and after its excavation and restoration. It was Merritt Park, however, that was the site of Manzanar's most photographed garden site. Photographed, as you know, just was displayed in the show by Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lange, and the camp photographer Toyo Miyataki, who wasn't allowed to but smuggled the camera into the camp. Takmuro supervised the construction, but the design is credited to the collective enterprise of the Nishi brothers, Akira and Koichiro. The densely planted garden was a 1-acre park, which included a series of ponds, bridges, waterfalls, and tea house, as you'll see in a second. It was essentially a Japanese stroll garden. At the park entrance were these 2 upright stones, which said in Japanese, to the memory of fellow Japanese immigrants who ushered to this place with the breaking of friendly relations between the 2 countries, have come to enjoy this quiet, peaceful place. And then it said the park was dedicated to the enjoyment of the people and to the memory of the time of our residence here. This is what Merritt Park looked like before the restoration in 2004. And then images here during its gradual restoration, which still continues to the current day. And you'll hear more about that soon. And here it is pretty much in the way it is at the moment, again, with the view to the Sierra in the distance. And this took, as you'll hear, kind of great effort, tremendous work, tremendous knowledge to unearth this and accurately do a restoration of it. And some dramatic elements here, the restoration of the reconstruction of the two bridges, the two different bridges that were an essential part of the pond. And you see those here reconstructed. And here, the same scene both in kind of winter and in summer. Okay. Reflecting on the paradox that Merritt Park represented, Jean Wakatsuki Houston wrote, sometimes in the evenings, and she was interned there as a young woman, sometimes in the evening you would walk down the raked gravel paths, you'd face away from the barracks, look past the tiny rapids towards the darkening mountains, and for a while not be a prisoner at all. You could hang suspended in some odd, almost lovely land you could not escape from, yet almost didn't want to leave. Under camp conditions, certain underlying traits and behaviors came to the fore, fundamental aspects of cultural identity, strategies of resistance and survival, both conscious and unconscious merged, an attitude of acceptance and resignation, shikaka kanai, it cannot be helped, coupled with the trait of gaman, perseverance and fortitude. And you see here, it's got a wonderful image of essentially a descendant of one of the internees and builders of the camp. Standing at the far edge of Manzanar is the fenced cemetery, and its monument is perhaps the single most identifiable symbol of the camp internment here. Let me repeat something I said last week. In the Shinto tradition, the landscape is filled with spirits called gamai, who inhabit elements of the natural world, and stones are particularly vessels for that. Jean Houston thought that the rock gardens would outlive the barracks, roads, and towers of Manzanar, and the camp's enduring legacy would be its stone gardens. She said, each stone has a mouth, speaking for a family, for some man who has beautified his doorstep and has found such stone gardens enduringly human. Finally, I thought I'd show another important garden. This one just down the hill from the Japanese garden in Portland. The Japanese-American Historical Park located in Tom McCall Park on the Willamette River waterfront. The monument was designed by Robert Murasi, who I used to work with, who was interned as a child. The plan is a giant crane, a symbol of good fortune and longevity. It's entered on a walk from the city that before the war was Portland's Nihonmachi, its Japantown. You walk past pylons that visually tell the history of the camps. It looks to the east in the direction of the camps, with all their names, including Manzanar, inscribed in the stone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Again, last week was fascinating, the images and discussion we had, and yet another moving presentation and sharing the sort of images that. So this the landscape is filled with spirit. That's very true in the Japanese garden traditions, and also the Japanese garden history in the U.S. and Canada cannot be really talked about without talking about the Japanese immigrant. And this Manzanar is a very important the part of the history in that sense as well. So here we are at the Portland Japanese Garden. Here I am working, maintaining this garden. It's really on the same vein of this long, actually the traditions, it is intending the Japanese American and Japanese carried through this hard time. So with this, actually, we like to actually take our audience back to 1942-45. Jeff will share the wonderful sort of incredible images. So Jeff, please actually share with us and take us back to the 1942 or 45.
Sure. So have you seen, we have a lot of black and white historic photographs of the gardens, and today, without much vegetation, Manzanar is mostly shades of gray. But fortunately, we also have some color movie footage shot at Manzanar by the CAP director, Ralph Merritt, a Caucasian teacher, and a visiting minister. From these, I've put together a short film showing a stroll through Merritt Park, ending at the Rose Garden, first started at the park by the Nishi brothers. It shows Merritt Park as it once was, green and vibrant, an oasis among the tar paper barracks. So we can start it. So when Merritt Park was first excavated in 2008, 2009, it was found to be relatively intact. It had not been filled with deconstruction debris or it hadn't been bulldozed, probably because the camp director wanted to turn his namesake park into a tourist attraction after Manzanar closed. But the landowners, the city of Los Angeles, didn't want anything there. So everything was abandoned in place. So at Manzanar, we have a garden management plan, and it calls for restoring Merritt Park with vegetation that's similar to what you see here. It'd be, the same shape and colors, but more drought-resistant vegetation. The ponds would be refilled, but we'd line the ponds so they would conserve water. And the water for the waterfalls would be recirculated, also to conserve water.
Mm-hmm.
This is Kurashio Nichi himself. He's the one credited with building and maintaining the garden, but he was also helped by a lot of other gardeners in the camp. This is his rose garden. Before the war, he owned a rose company in the Los Angeles area, and he brought some of his roses up with him to start this garden. That's it.
Thank you, Jeff. Wow, this is, look at his smile at the end of the video. Just it's incredible. Talking about the effort, actually, it's way beyond the efforts. Just watching the video clips, it's hard to believe that was in 1940s and in that location. Just mind-boggling for me. So actually now we like to actually go into the little discussion and Q&A. So with Pat and Jeff and Kenneth. So first of all, the Kenneth told us that his presentation is very much the product of fruitful collaboration with you, Jeff. And also I recognize a few slides in that presentation that I saw in Japanese Garden Association's conference a couple of years back in Portland. So with you being the pretty much the center of this research and unearthing the history, I'd like to start with you, Jeff, just the first question. So what was the most impactful resonating aspect of Manzanar as a cultural heritage site for you as a longtime researcher and archaeologist, and today is a guardian of this historical site?
Well, first, it was realizing how much of the site was still visible after, decades of abandonment. People realized the place was important for its historical association, but not that there were still so many physical traces of the World War II incarceration present. The most obvious when we first recorded the site were the foundations. When the buildings were dismantled and removed, many of the foundations were left, showing precisely where these buildings were. There was a latrine slab, showed how close together the toilets were, how little privacy they had. The artifacts on this service told us about the people, marbles from children, bobby pins from women, gold pieces from elders. Artifacts, including those typically American, made it harder to stereotype this group. Second, realizing how much of the site lay buried. For decades, Los Angeles recharged the groundwater table by spreading water throughout the area, which caused erosion and deposited a lot of sands and silts. Low spots like garden ponds were completely filled in, and even garden rock arrangements were buried. Uncovering the garden, sometimes with the descendants of the garden buildings, was both exciting and poignant. We wondered, how could incarcerated people build such beautiful places? How could people cope with the loss of their homes, businesses, educational opportunities, and most of all, their freedom, and still show such resilience? Third, and most importantly, realizing how much of an impact the traces of Manzanar could have on visitors today. The effect could be life-changing. Once while I was giving a tour, a visitor argued that the incarceration was justified until he saw a child's toy on the ground. The archaeology helps the site become a place of remembrance and contemplation for both small day-to-day life and big political and social issues. The small things humanize the incarcerees. How was a baby spoon lost? Where did Jackarai get the rocks and fish for his pond? How did the elderly and parents with small children cope with the long walk to communal latrines, especially on days like today that's, it's cold and windy and snowing at Manzanar? One former incarceree told us you couldn't realize how miserable life at Manzanar was until you participated in one of our archaeology projects and experienced the same harsh weather conditions and dust as the incarcerees. And finally, the big issues are as relevant now as they were during World War II. During our community archaeology projects, volunteers have time to consider the history in depth and discuss issues still of concern to our country, like racism, the treatment of immigrants, and the fragility of civil rights. Sometimes when I'm at Manzanar, it's disheartening to how relevant Manzanar still is. At those times, it helps to have the gardens to take care of and contemplate.
Thank you. And indeed, I remember a few years back, the first time and only time so far, I visited the sites and the impact and this question of why gardens and why here. And again, it resonates and keep resonating more and more. And so the last week discussion and this week is really, for me personally, very special. Also as a professional Japanese gardener, it has a lot to learn from even today. So now, Pat, so that question for you. So Aki and I remember the way probably 3 years back, and you were one of the people who came to the garden, and then we talk about, and you shared the gardens in Manzanar, and then 3 photographers. So eventually, so that's really enticing us to have this special exhibition now. So at the 75th anniversary of the end of the World War II. So can you walk us through why gardens and very sort of history and remembrance of the Japanese American experience in Manzanar, and perhaps other concentration camp you have studied or visited?
Yeah, it really started for me when I first saw the Ansel Adams photograph.
Mm.
And what I learned from that was that I learned that this was a garden that my father-in-law's father had built. And that really intrigued me. It captivated my imagination about what was it like, back then, what was involved in building it. It just really captivated me, especially since it was from a prolific photographer like Ansel Adams. But more importantly, because it was part of the history, it just got me intrigued about learning more and more about the history. And I got even more, how you'd say, just ingrained in the activity associated with it. And so I took a photo of my late father-in-law here. So it was his father that built the garden. And this was after we completed the bridge and obviously all the excavations. So this was in 2011. And it just meant so much to me to hear these stories from him. And so part of this history that I learned about was, of course, about the Rose Nursery and their landscaping business that his father had started in Los Angeles. It was actually on the northwest corner of Wilshire Boulevard and Sepulveda Boulevard, which is adjacent to the Veterans Administration Cemetery. And he was actually well known in the Los Angeles area. And Angeles Flower Mart for his contribution to Los Angeles and so they had this sprawling business already established, and ultimately had to surrender it when the FBI came at 9 p.m. on the night of December 7th, 1941, and took Koichiro away. And my father-in-law, who's pictured here on the lower left, basically had consulted with his mother. And what they ultimately ended up deciding to do is donate the stock of the garden, of the nursery and the landscaping business to the Veterans Administration. It was really striking to me that she came to this decision. First of all, because they were offered money for their stock by other businesses, but was pennies on the dollar. The largest, she valued it at something around $10,000, but the largest offer that they got was $6,000. So at least that wasn't pennies on the dollar. But ultimately she decided, I'm just going to give it to the government. And it just struck me, one of those things that really struck me, how can you give your business over and all this to the government who has, unjustly removed you from your homes? And so, but, it's following that tradition that was spoken of earlier, shikataganai, which is, it can't be helped. It was a theme of acceptance. And yet to me, it seemed, it would just seem wrong to do this. But they went and donated it. And my father-in-law told me, well, hey, the Veterans Administration was happy to get it. And they used it for landscaping, and they used it for the cemetery. So it was a contribution to the country, not a contribution necessarily to your captors or anything like that. It's just my personal opinion about how they may have seen it. But what was really helpful to me is being able to participate in the volunteer programs at Manzanar National Historic Site, and starting off with the excavation and finding the Turtle Rock. The Turtle Rock was one of the features that I had heard about a great deal. And that's pictured over here on the lower left. And we found it. You see it prominently. It's a prominent feature in the Ansel Adams photograph. We uncovered it. We installed the spans of the bridge, and that worked out really good, except for the fact that they were 850 pounds, awfully heavy to deal with. And my late father-in-law, pictured here in the lower right, filmed by NHK while we were doing this, 93 years old at the time, to put this 850-pound stringer in place. He was relentless. So I was really, really, proud of what he was able to do to try and reconstruct his father's garden when we went out and did this. But my interest didn't just stop at Manzanar. I wanted to learn a little bit more about this particular part of history because I'd never learned about it in history books in school. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about it. And as it turns out, on one of our outings, my wife and I, we walked our dog over by the, this was the Hood River Museum, Hood River County Museum. And we happened upon this stone that had this Japanese poem on it. And we found out that it was about the Japanese Americans who had worked the land there and then were taken away to Minidoka, in this case, rustled up in the Portland Assembly Center, which was located in at the Portland Expo Center, and then taken over to Minidoka. And then after the war, they weren't welcomed back. And so that just intrigued me to learn more and more about the other 9 centers. So it started off with just seeing that photograph and just becoming a student of history after that.
Great. I think it's again, it's so personal, and it's many people, and also this notion of shikataganai can help. I'm sure the Pat you have heard many times, and still today the great the earthquakes in 2011 and in Japan, and from time to time and throughout the Japanese history, this shikataganai, just this is the one way to cope with otherwise no one has any control over, like a natural disaster. So in Tohoku, this phrase comes so many times on TVs and discussion. So it's Manzanar is another one I have heard many times. So now turn to Kenny. So we talked about the sort of 1,000 feet view over big picture of why gardens and what garden making means and how essential the making of the gardens and that makes actually us a human. So now we are down and it's a more specific type of garden, namely Japanese garden, and in Manzanar. And you have spent, I'm sure, a great deal of time to look into all aspects. So what, if any, uniqueness that do you find in the making of Japanese gardens that might be culture specific?
Sure. But first, though, when I'm struck by both Jeff's and Pat's remarks, how stories are embedded in places. And you can, learn those stories just from artifacts, as Jeff has noted, just finding, children's, toys and elements and so on. And then the stories that Jeff's unearthed both from his biography and families, and that those stories still continue. I wanted to ask, we couldn't do it at the group, how many people who are participants here have actually been to Manzanar? And I'm sure there are people who have been, and I'm sure you realize that being in the place is the best way to understand the story and to try to get a visceral sense, at least some visceral sense of what it was like to have been there in the 1940s. So I would urge people, as many as possible, as to do that, as if you can. You asked a question about the kind of specificity of Japanese culture and the garden, Japanese gardens and the culture. Japan is a garden making culture. Not all cultures are. England's a garden making culture. Japan's a garden making culture. The United States, we're not a garden making culture. We make gardens, but it's not embedded as an essential part of the culture. In Japanese culture, gardens are part of the culture, gardens and landscapes at all scales. Literally from a single plant, from flowers. There's a whole, as you know, whole kind of, art of flower arranging and flower making, to the residential garden, to the public places, to people's appreciation and understanding of the kind of larger landscape from a symbolic perspective of mountains, of water bodies, of topography and so on, which deeply resonate in Japan. And it's embedded in the culture in all the arts. Garden making is an art, literature is an art, poetry, song, all of these arts, you will find gardens as an essential part of that, and they fuse each other. There's songs about actual gardens. There's songs about actual places. They're gardens that symbolically represent larger landscapes and other places. So it's intertwined in the culture. You see it in dress, you see it in fabric, you see it in ornamentation. It's there throughout. I hope that addresses that. Sadaf, you were silent.
So I like the words gardens in all scales, which is true. And it's very much, again, there's a one and maybe few sort of underpinning sort of philosophy or way, attitude towards nature or gardens and in all those activities. And it's, thank you. I'm learning more and more at this age. And I really appreciate that your comment and the ways you see these gardens. So back to Jeff. So you've been doing this great deal of research and making efforts and studies across the different sort of parts of the, actually 540 acres. Is that true? That's the size of Manzanar?
640.
Okay, so I figured.
Close.
Okay. And so there's all kinds of aspects and archaeological digs and findings. And yet in your, this big, 450 pages, a big volume of report and management plan, we come to across basically you're stating that the character defining elements of Manzanar is cultural landscape. So basically the gardens. So could you elaborate on how you come to view the garden as a sort of central part of cultural legacies of this intern community?
Sure. When I first started working at Manzanar in 1993, doing archaeological survey, I recognized that these gardens were important features, but it's been a long process. It might be hard to believe, but I didn't become an archaeologist to restore Japanese gardens. As a part of its planning process, when the National Park Service took over Manzanar, they asked former incarcerees what they wanted to see at Manzanar, and one of the most frequently said things was to restore gardens, but mostly the gardens were buried. Once we started uncovering the gardens, garden experts like Seito Goto and Kento Brown and others helped me see why these gardens are important, that they represent the continuation of a long tradition that you might have thought would have been extinguished during World War II in America. I went to Japan to study gardens and work with Japanese gardeners. And Japanese gardeners from Japan, Canada, and elsewhere have come to Manzanar to share their knowledge with me. Children of garden builders like Nishi, Muto, and Ogami have returned to Manzanar and talked about their father's love of the gardens they built and what they meant to the families. What I've learned from all these teachers and mentors is just how important these gardens were to those incarcerated, how the gardens provided an improvement to the bleak landscape of the camp, a connection to nature, and that they were a gift to their families, their neighbors, and their community. I also learned that the gardens are not simply acts of defiance or resistance, but a symbol of resilience and hope. the gardens in Manzanar were made for their own community and not for their clients like they used to. They shared a shared reflection of their own traditions and culture, of the importance of nature for the physical, mental, and spiritual health, and for a hopeful future beyond the barbed wire. And I believe all these lessons that you can get from the Manzanar Gardens are still relevant today, when we're dealing with a pandemic or fascism or whatever the next crisis is.
Thank you, Jeff. And it's indeed, that's very true. And it's sort of the Japanese or any probably human being that's seeking the connection to nature, even in such a sort of harsh, sort of unbelievably impossible, seemingly, but yet they did in very short. And that's always kind of surprises me how it just 3-4 years. That's very short. So they have done, and as Jeff said, some gardens, or actually Kenny said that some gardens started a month after they're interned. That's unbelievable how their mind works to just make a connection to the gardens. I can see the vegetable gardens, but it's hard to believe someone think about the moving the rocks. So that's fascinating. And so the next one is an interesting story, Pat. We're very particularly struck by one of the story you told us. The story was about the young Latino American who voluntarily actually went to the camp out of, basically just showing his solidarity with his Japanese American friends, and also firmly believing that it was the wrong things for the government to do. So why this story about this young man actually joining voluntarily to the camp, and why it's particularly important story for you to keep actually telling and spreading, in particular, and especially in this time and age, and with this divisiveness that's in place now.
Yeah, I think it's another story that's pretty important to me, particularly because I'm Latino American myself, and of course, marrying into a Japanese American family, I got to experience, both areas of culture. But when I heard about this story, this was a story about this person from a different ethnic background seeing something being done that was wrong to another ethnic background. And the way that he decided to participate was by showing a very real support, because these people were physically being affected just because of their ancestry and as a perceived threat that really never materialized. And so he actually joined them and went to Manzanar with them. He didn't have to go, but he did. What higher support can you offer than to join those people physically and physically walk in their shoes? So I think this story especially resonates today, as we see with people supporting the Black Lives Matter movement from all walks of life. And the common denominator is that people are protesting what's actually happening in our world, people that we are seeing things happening here. And they're not perceived threats. These are threats that are actually happening to people, and with very physical consequences. And so when Ralph Lazo voluntarily joined his friends, that's the way he was protesting, but very physically protesting. And so I just really found it very heartening to me. He made friends. Obviously, there's a picture here that I got from the Japanese American National Museum that with his friends there in Manzanar. When I went to go to see an exhibit, George Takei's exhibit from 2017 at the Japanese American Museum, there was this exhibit there with Ralph Lazo's picture. And I think what really struck me there was, at the very bottom of that particular exhibit, there was a last sentence there stating that he was asked, well, why did you go to camp? You didn't have to go. And he would reply simply that none of us should have had to go. And that was, to me, was really representing a core message that resonates of this idea that when injustice is done to a few, it's been done to all. And he felt that he was going to be a part of that all. So that's kind of how I connected to it. And I found that, there's a movie that was made of this, a very short film, about 30 minutes long, but it's out there on YouTube. And so you really want to learn about a little bit about this story. You can go to YouTube and actually view the video, and it's called Stand Up for Justice, which is exactly what he's doing, and same kind of stuff that's happening today.
Thank you. It's great. This for all our audience, and please stand up for justice. Just great, and also that no one should be interned. So that's a very powerful lesson. So thank you very much, Pat. So I have one more question. Then actually, I'd like to turn to the audience to ask some question through. Aki has been monitoring the question, but so the last question, but this is a kind of big one. Back to Kenny. So big question that for me as a landscape architect and a student of the cultural landscape. So this is not about the findings in the Manzanar, but what we can learn from them, and then in today's this difficult time. So what do you think the evolving role of landscape architects and cultural landscape scholars for this contemporary society, and particularly in such sort of life-changing experience we are all together going through with this, I would say, misfortune, but it's also the caused by ourselves, and just if you can kind of shed the light on. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, you're asking about the evolving roles of landscape architect. One is our continuing role of creating places for people at all scales, from home to neighborhood to regions, and doing that in a responsible way in terms of the environment, what we now speak of as sustainability. But I think landscape architecture, at our best, we respond to the key issues of our time, and particularly in recognition that landscapes change. They're organic. They change over time in terms of natural forces and human forces. So there's certain key issues that are confronting the world and certainly confronting our society at the moment. Climate change is perhaps the most dramatic. And we see that in terms of how designers need to respond to changes, physical changes in the environment, the changes in the actual climate. And we see it in terms of heat, fires, coastal environments, all of which demand design changes and taking that into consideration. We see dramatic moves in our society, importantly, to try to create a more socially just and equitable environment. And Manzanar certainly suggests what happens when we don't do that. And design addresses that at all scales, both in actual design and in terms of policies that people do. I think you're also seeing, again, in recognitions that landscape change, and we have to deal with that. There's a changing morphology, the literal form of our environment. Our cities are different than they were 50 years ago. They're going to be radically different in 50 years from now. Our cars were different 50 years ago. They're going to be radically different in 50 years, all of which entail landscape change. Our downtowns are different. What are we going to do with the 2,000 dead malls that we have in America? These are all landscape design questions and problems. And we're living right now through the pandemic, an era when we're dramatically aware of public health. And in terms of the history of my profession, landscape architecture in the 19th century began as part of public health movements, where parks and open spaces were seen as part of the public health of a community. And I think we now understand that in a deeper environmental and ecological way, but that's another thing that we deal with dramatically, need to deal with in design. And maybe lastly, both positively and negatively, if you will, the virus reminds us that nature can be deadly and sustaining at the same time. And it's our responsibility to care for that in the best possible way. And I think that's part of the ethic, hopefully, of my profession. There was a question in the chat, which I was going to ask. I can answer a bit, but I think Jeff can answer better. Someone asked, were there gardens in other camps? And they certainly were. And some of those, most dramatically at Minidoka, have been studied. But I think there were gardens at all camps, perhaps more dramatically in Manzanar and Minidoka. But maybe Jeff can answer that better.
All right. Thank you very much for the kind of summarizing this part of the discussion. But it really resonates. One thing is the nature can be deadly. So there's actually a long history in even this is something I was told many times by my grandparents. Whether a stranger out of village is a god or evil, depending on how you treat. So there's many actually small stone monuments actually in the outskirts of the village. Mm-hmm. That's typically the boundary of the village, and then strangers, anyone coming from outside. So that can be evil, but same time that same can be the god. So it's a traditional, many Shinto rituals are basically based on that. So it's really dancing with the deities, that's one way, and offering some food, that's another way. But they never fight, and they always welcome. So that's what we've been taught in Japan. So maybe that's something we need to remind ourselves of, we need to think about again. So thank you very much again. So instead of the path, this notion of Japanese sort of saying the shikata ga nai, maybe shikata ga nai is not enough now. We have to act on. And I really respect Ralph and his attitude. And I am very much looking forward to the young generation. I have a 16 years old daughter, and I sort of resonate her attitude towards what Ralph did way back. So it's time. I think we are almost on time, pretty good. So I'd like to actually turn microphone back to our MC, Aksan. If there's any question from the audience, we can move to that part of this discussion.
Sure. I guess I'm still kind of remaining audible to all the audience members. If one of our operators can actually turn my video back on, that'd be brilliant. But I guess I can just remain kind of invisible actually for the time being. The very first question actually came from Patricia. What was the source of water for all the gardens? I guess that's best addressed to Jeffrey.
Sure. Each of the barracks had an outdoor faucet for where they could get water, and they would connect their gardens to that faucet, and they would just let the water run into the garden and then run out of the garden, overflow into the sewer system. And Manzanar has plenty of water from snowmelt in the Sierras. But eventually they did have so many gardens that they were running out of water, and the administration did limit their use of water for the gardens between certain hours, mostly when people were lining up for meals at the mess hall gardens is when they could let the water run. So yeah, there's plenty of water available and easily available because of the outdoor faucets.
All right, okay. Great, thank you so much. The next question came from John. Are there any others of the gardens that are being considered for restoration? I guess he's talking about Manzanar, this specific location. So yeah, this question probably is best addressed to you again, Jeffrey.
Sure. So at Manzanar, we have a garden management plan, and it calls for fully restoring 3 of our Japanese gardens. We chose 3 because there's basically 3 types of Japanese gardens at Manzanar. There's the barracks gardens for the families. We have mess hall gardens, which were for the neighborhood, and then we have community gardens like Merritt Park, Cherry Park, and the hospital gardens for the community. And we chose 1 of each to restore completely, which means bringing back vegetation, bringing back water, bringing back some of the the wood features like the gazebos and fences. But another of other gardens would also be partially restored, which meant, uncovering them so you can see the basic framework, but not adding water or vegetation, just keeping the vegetation alive that's already there. And if you're interested, the garden management report is available online. If you just Google Manzanar Garden Management Report, you should be able to get to a link to it.
Great, thank you so much. That was a very thorough answer. Any other questions?
I think Jeff could answer the question I asked about gardens in other camps.
All right, yeah.
And how extensive that was. Maybe Jeff, you could answer that.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. All the camps had gardens. Some of them were pretty extensive. I think Manzanar is kind of unique in that, it had an abundance of water. It had, abundance of rocks just outside of the camp that you could gather and use for the construction of gardens. And it also had an administration that allowed people to go outside the camp to gather these rocks. So, like Gila River in Arizona probably has more gardens than Manzanar, but they have very little rocks. So most of their gardens are like cement ponds. Some of the other camps, they didn't have access to water or rocks. So, they have a few gardens. And they would mostly be, vegetable gardens or, what we call victory gardens. And another problem is, after the camps closed, a lot of them were developed for agricultural uses, and a lot of these garden features were destroyed. So Manzanar is kind of unique in that it was abandoned and nothing came in afterwards. So a lot of it lay buried where we can still find it. Whereas, like Poston at the Gila River, the Colorado River area, they had some huge gardens, but they're all gone now because it's all farmland.
I see what you mean.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. So I guess, that's all the questions that actually came in during the program. If you want to move on to the next segment, you're more than welcome to.
So just actually, still, I think we have a little bit of time. So I'd like to, Aksan, can I ask just a quick question?
Right. Yeah. By all, yes. Yeah. Before
garden is,
yeah, please.
Garden in the way I see is, garden outlive our life, and in this way, even the ones destroyed or gone can revive. So this notion of the garden is fragile at the same time, and yet the sort of, I guess my question is really, I'm talking about the Japanese finding the rocks as a sort of main component. So in a way, me too, as a Japanese, if there's any place, if there's a rock, we can make a garden out of that. So is there any sort of anything, Kenneth, if you can make a comment on that use of the rocks. And in a unique way, I believe in Japan is the use as is, as opposed to cutting, chipping, and doing things. But it's the natural borders, and I see this Manzanar is just an incredible amount, and I'm sure elsewhere. But they had rocks, at least at the end. So seems like
I don't know, there's just a thought. There may be something more basic there. If you go to the beach, and we've all been to the beach or the coast as we refer to it in Oregon, what do you have? You have water, you have sand, you have rocks, and if you might have driftwood. Watch what people make at the beach. They make places, they make enclosures, they make habitation, they ornament it, they make gardens. They're short-lived. So I think there's something about the material and the interaction of those materials. Sand you can make into anything else. You can arrange stone in kind of an infinite number of patterns. Water is alive and part of us. So I think there's something that's so fundamental to that. And then it's given this, if you will, this deep layer, these multiple layers of symbolic meaning and cultural meaning that's specific to Japan, but I think there's something underlying that that's more fundamental.
Thank you. And so one quick last comment, then Pat, it just if you can kind of summarize in a short time, but what you so still your journey continues, and anything in particularly in where we are right now, and many difficult hardships. So if you can offer some sort of wisdom or comments and what you found from your journey.
Well, I think what I found was, comfort in these gardens and, what they were built for, and seeing them as a place where a community basically gathers, right? And in Portland, I think I found, a very welcoming community here. And so I make that connection from that standpoint, and going out and learning about, Hood River and that area, and Minidoka and some of the other concentration camps where gardens were built, is where my journey is going to continue on. I'm going to learn more about the history around these other concentration camps, and learn more about the history around even our own family and the families of those that built gardens in other places.
Thank you. So we'll talk more. Please visit the garden.
I'm always visiting the Portland Garden for sure.
Thank you. So just again, one last quick comment from Jeff. So I'm especially intrigued by the sort of the role of Japanese immigrant. I've been studying the Japanese immigrant, in particular in this field of landscape gardening, in particular in California. And there's only one actually active group of Japanese descendant or Japanese gardeners association exists only in Canada, Vancouver. So that's the last one. And I'm sure that there's a great, big, sizable organization in Los Angeles areas and California elsewhere by thousands. So I'm hoping with this Manzanar study and research, it somehow sort of stimulates the study of this already doesn't exist in California, yet has a very rich history of Japanese immigrant being in agriculture and horticulture fields, and actually built a great deal of the foundation. That's where we stand on as a Japanese garden in this country. So any comments on that?
Well, the difference between, I guess, the United States and Canada is, in the Los Angeles area, the Japanese American community pretty much has moved away from gardening as a vocation. It's been taken over now by a new generation of immigrants, Mexican Americans. The Japanese American next generation has moved into, other jobs, other occupations.
Yeah, so I think again, the different generation, different group of people comes and goes, and move the history, just keep pushing the sort of landscape industry forward. So that's very fascinating. And again, thank you very much for you all. So Aki-san, back to you, just some closing of this discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yep, okay. Just trying to get the gist of this this webinar panelist function. Sorry. Well, whoa! I mean, yeah. So I'm just gonna try to close this amazingly. Oh my God! This has been yet another tour de force of a discussion, and absolutely intriguing presentation and conversation today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, actually. Like I said earlier, tour de force really is the word that I have for this series of discussion, actually, all grounded in the shared passion to make sense of the particular chapter of the US history, and really bring home what it means to foster community through shared appreciation of nature, from vegetation to, like Kenneth alluded to multiple times, self-expression. So with the advent of new technologies all around us, just like this Zoom platform we are using right now, it sounded as if we just need to go back to the natural order of things as much as possible these days, while also affirming and embracing one's cultural identity, no matter where you might come from. So the art exhibition that set out to not only showcase the artistry of three legendary photographers, but also to remind us all of the resourcefulness, ingenuity, and of course, resilience of the internees became even more complete with all these three virtual panel discussions, I believe. I particularly like the footage that you showed at the very beginning, the footage that Jeff kindly shared, really brought life to the still images that I'd been so familiar with over the past couple of months, actually. That footage actually was also recommended by our friend in New York, very discerning friend, actually, Linda Hoagland. She actually recommended that footage to me as a member maybe 2 months ago. When I first saw it, I was like blown away. So through the examination of the universal practice of garden making under harsh circumstances, we saw how humankind is bonded by these relationships with land. By looking at specific former campsites and scrutinizing them, we saw evidence of cultural memes springing among the Japanese Americans, I guess utilizing what was available to them, that also kind of reflected their struggle, or rather balancing act between keeping the traditions of Japan, but also trying to make it work for their version of new reality to fit their situations, kind of pointing to this question of authenticity as well. And this was particularly interesting to me and all of us here at the Garden, as we constantly debate about authenticity. What makes a garden authentically Japanese? So this perhaps could be a discussion topic for another time. All in all, just social justice, artistic excellence, need for self-expression, for spiritual survival, cultural authenticity, engineered versus natural environments, and also evolving roles of the cultural legacy centers, like the Japanese American National Museum and National Japanese American Museum of Oregon. Their evolving role as cultural center for minority groups in this country were some of the topics and themes that were touched by the distinguished speakers throughout the three sessions. And by having you, the viewers, participate in these interactive sessions, it all reminded us of the relevance that those stories still carry for all of us going through the current times, as we navigate these uncertain times with increasing polarization and, like Jeffrey alluded to earlier, accelerating environmental crisis. So put simply, we all need gardens, and preferably Japanese gardens, I hope. Again, I feel forever remiss if I didn't thank all the partners for this colossal project, including the Oregon Historical Society, the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, the Japanese American Museum in Los Angeles, that's National Museum, the US-Japan Council, along with sponsors, Cambria Health Solutions, Melville Clark, McDonald Fund, Oregon Cultural Trust, as well as Jackson Foundation. And of course, all these generous individual supporters, Joe and Dee Dee Yeager, Cheryl Atchison, Kei Kitagawa and Andrew Johnson-Laird, and of course, Cal and Meiho Tanabe. Thank you all so much for giving us your vote of confidence through these truly turbulent times. And thank you again to Ken, Jeffrey, and Pat for your incredible thought journey, along with Sada Uchiyama. And we all look forward to your visit to the garden when the situation allows. And I don't usually sing praises for my own colleagues, but since this is the last one of the series, I'd like to give a shout out to our colleagues, our teammates Kanako Yanagi, Mayuko Sasanuma. We could not have done this without you. And also a quick gratitude for our marketing colleagues who worked tirelessly to navigate this project without a map. Director Megumi Kato and her colleagues, Hannah Steelman and Michael Anderson. Thank you all so much for your dedication and absolutely amazing professionalism. And of course, we thank you again, watching us, tuning in from wherever you are tuning in from, the viewers who took the time out to join us today. Thank you so much. Do please stay safe and well, and thank you for the privilege of your participation. Thank you so much.